founders would be, even if they wanted to invoke them. Now, you often hear, and I think it is a somewhat useful construct as long as it's not taken too literally, American constitutional thought is generally set up. Who is that? Who is that man with that dulcet voice? Sorry, are we testing the audio?
Not anymore.
No, we just got a little feedback. I thought that was the ghost of historians past speaking to us for a moment. So, American constitutional thought is oftentimes described as being defined by two poles. On the one hand, you have supporters of the so-called living constitution, and on the other hand, you have supporters of so-called originalism. Well, I think it's fair to say that there are hardly any pure originalists and hardly any pure living constitutionalists. Even the late Justice Antonin Scalia was often described as a faint-hearted originalist, and the jurist most closely associated with the idea of a living constitution, William Brennan, actually quoted the founders more often than the leading originalist on the court at the same time as William Rehnquist. So basically, all people in American constitutional law start with the Constitution, and the key question is, does the inquiry end there, and how do they interpret the words of the Constitution? Do they interpret it in a very crimped and narrow way, or do they interpret it in a more sort of expansive way? Now, in the case of, since I haven't memorized the Constitution, I'm going to read to you the relevant clauses dealing with impeachment. One of my favorite articles, apparently the favorite article of our current president, although I'm sure if we quizzed him, he wouldn't know how many articles there were and wouldn't be able to name very many features of the Constitution. Article 2, Section 4 says, the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So the question is, what do those words mean? It's also quite clear that Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5 gives the House of Representatives, and I quote, the sole power to bring charges against federal officers, including the president. Article 1, Section 30, Clause 6 gives the Senate the power to try an official facing impeachment charges stated in the articles. So, what does all of that constitutional language mean? Well, the first thing to keep in mind, and if you listen to contemporary pundits, sometimes are very good, sometimes they're not so good. Essentially, impeachment is put into the Constitution because of a pervasive fear among the founders of the threat of corruption. The idea that power corrupts all and absolute power corrupts absolutely, although that quote comes from the great 19th century historian Lord Acton, the founders are well schooled in a tradition of British thought, and indeed a tradition that in some sense goes back to the Renaissance and Machiavelli, where all of politics is seen as a tension between liberty and tyranny. And of course, the goal is to preserve liberty and to stave off tyranny. Now, we in modern America have a very capacious language to think about issues of liberty. We have a much less capacious vocabulary to think about how government and how law and how regulation does not stand in opposition to liberty, but in the founding generation, law and liberty and regulation would have been thought as the only way to preserve liberty. Without law and without regulation, without strong government, there is no liberty. That was kind of the problem of the Articles of Confederation, that they had this relatively weak government. For those of you who have either recently taken your American history or remember back to high school, the Articles of Confederation is kind of like America's first marriage that it doesn't like to speak about. It's, or as I like to say, America was sort of like dating on the rebound. We were dating the Great Britain. We had this strong government, this powerful parliament. So the next thing we do is we go out and create this fairly weak government. In fact, didn't really have an executive, and the legislature didn't have the power to tax. You should think about that for a moment, a government without the power to tax. How many of you would pay your taxes if it was optional? Show of hands. No hands going. Not virtuous, not very virtuous. Anyway, the founders sort of realized that it was a bit too much to expect people to actually pay taxes out of the goodness of their heart. And the Constitution is part of this scheme of government which endeavors to try and make government powerful enough to do what it needs to do, but not so powerful that it threatens liberty. So For instance, when you think about creating a strong executive, the founders recognized that the Articles of Confederation had virtually no executive. In fact, everything was done by committee. And if you've ever been on a committee in college or in high school, you know what it's like trying to get things done by committee. You know, they say that like a platypus is an animal designed by committee, right? Because nothing really fits together the way it's supposed to. Well, the founders recognized that for certain functions, core executive functions like being commander-in-chief, executing the laws, you had to have a unified executive. But they did not want that new unified executive to become tyrannical. They did not want another monarch. So impeachment is designed to provide a check on a potentially corrupt leader in the case of the president. So, for instance, you often have heard among sort of contemporary pundits that we shouldn't be moving forward with impeachment because we have an election coming up. Well, there are very few things that I'm comfortable saying I can say with like 110% that the founders wouldn't have agreed with a statement. But one of the few statements I can say with 110% certainty is that the founders absolutely would not have agreed with that sentiment. Why do I say that? Because the people did not elect the president. That's why we have an electoral college. So the argument that we would leave things to an election makes no sense from the point of view, particularly if you're an originalist claiming to be faithful to the original meaning of the Constitution, because the people did not directly vote for the president originally. That's why we have the electoral college. So why do we have impeachment? Well, perhaps, and you may have heard this quoted, and again, since I haven't memorized all 80 plus numbers of the Federalist, by the way, how many of you have read at least something by the great triumvirate of Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, the Federalist? Anyone not read anything from the Federalist in the audience? Go. Well, you need to take another history class. Great thing about Fordham is I think, like when I ask how many people have read at least something by Plato or Aristotle, the number of hands that go up in any room is almost everyone. So let's hear it for that Jesuit education. Anyway, if I wasn't alive back here, I might say something else about that, but my kids might be listening, and one of them went to Fordham. So let's go back to Hamilton. Hamilton says, the subjects of its jurisdiction, referring to impeachment, are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. And then Hamilton goes on at some length to figure out where should this crime be prosecuted, this public crime, this political crime? Who is the best part of this new federal government to handle it? Should it be a court? Should it be the Supreme Court? And Hamilton concludes that the best way to do it is to have the representatives of the people, the House of Representatives, decide whether charges are warranted, and to have the Senate, which is a much more independent body in the original Constitution. It's not directly elected by the people in the 18th century. To have the Senate act as the jury and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court act as the judge. So if we're thinking about this process, the House acts kind of like a grand jury, gathers evidence, and the Senate is to act like a jury. Now, what does Hamilton mean when he says the offenses are political? And here we come to like the problem of translation. Because one of the big problems when we try to understand the 18th century Constitution is it's written in English, but it's written in an English that is inflected by a whole series of ideas that in some ways are quite alien to us. I mean, these are people who, for instance, when you pick up a newspaper, someone will sign their name Publius. When was the last time you picked up a newspaper and at the bottom of the article, somebody signed their name Publius? I mean, it's a different world where people, when they want to don a rhetorical mask, turn to classical antiquity. Thomas Jefferson, famously decided that the structure of the Virginia state capitol had to be based on the pure simplicity of Roman architecture. Anything else would put the public soul of his home state of Virginia at risk. Of course, Jefferson was the kind of guy who got kind of teary-eyed over architecture. And as I point out to my students, it's great to compare the letters Jefferson writes about women to the letters he writes about buildings, because the letters he writes about women are kind of dull and boring, and the letters he writes about architecture are really steamy. That's the kind of guy he was. But if you've ever been to Monticello, you know why, because the guy literally designed the parquet in the floors and the window treatments. That's how obsessed he was about the aesthetics and architecture. So what does it mean to be political? We, in our world, tend to think of politics and being political as perhaps the lowest and most scurrilous thing you can say. That's how you dismiss something. Oh, that's just politics. Oh, that's just political. Well, the founding generation were heirs to a tradition that literally stretches back to Aristotle. And again, since you're good Fordham students, you know that Aristotle famously wrote that man is a political animal. And by that, he didn't mean man was somehow low and bestial. In fact, he meant that man had the capacity, man sort of in that sort of generic sense. Aristotle undoubtedly was very gendered. I'm using it in a less gendered sense. That politics was, in fact, the highest calling of a person. In fact, Jefferson, to turn back to one of the most often people invoked as one of our founders, although famously not sitting in the Constitutional Convention, he's off in Paris drinking Chateau Lafite 1785, and having his pastry chef, Madison Hemmings, trained in the latest techniques of French pastry making. But that's a subject for another day. But anyway, when Jefferson writes to his nephew about what he should do with his life, he says, first, you must study the history of antiquity, the history of Rome and Greece, and you must prepare yourself to enter the public stage. So again, rather than being something low and scurrilous and a way of dismissing something's importance, politics was the highest calling you had as a human being. And of course, in The Federalist, James Madison famously says, what is politics but the greatest commentary on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, nor would there be restraints necessary. So when Hamilton says the offenses are political, he's not actually saying what we would call partisan. He's talking about that you have harmed the body politic. And if you think about it, there are all kinds of things you could do which might not technically be illegal, but which would amount to a betrayal of your public trust, would amount to putting the interests of yourself, your family, your state, your region, your religion, any of the many different identities we have as citizens ahead of the public good. And what Hamilton was basically saying was when someone does that, they have crossed into the territory which makes their actions potentially impeachable. If you go on into that same number of The Federalist, Hamilton in fact acknowledges that once an impeachment proceeding has begun, you will unleash partisan fury. And by that, he means the kind of party above everything else kind of mentality, which in fact is something we're seeing today. One of the things I think the founders were all to the last person opposed to the idea of political parties, although they, of course, helped invent them reluctantly, particularly in the 1790s. But Jefferson, again, famously said that if he could only go to heaven as a member of a political party, he'd rather not go, which is saying something. So it's important to keep in mind that partisanship is, for the founders, the great danger to be avoided at all costs. It is a form of factionalism. And some of you, if you've taken any course in American politics or American history, you know Madison famously writes about the danger of factionalism. So what Hamilton and the others who are responsible for crafting the impeachment clause try to do is they try to build in a means to restrain the very powerful executive they've created, particularly when that executive has betrayed his public trust. And one of the things that's kind of unusual about the Constitution is the oath you take to be president is actually written in the Constitution. So our Constitution literally puts the oath necessary to assume public office on par with the rest of the constitutional text. So to betray that oath is quite literally to betray the Constitution. And that ultimately, of course, is the greatest of impeachable offenses, is to take action which undermines or corrupts the Constitution. And of course, the key question that Americans face now is what to do about what we see before us. Has President Trump's actions, particularly in regard to what we know about his upholding aid to Ukraine, has that crossed the threshold that the founders put in the Constitution? Has he, in effect, betrayed his office? And again, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Hammer in a minute. The key question is not what do we, the American people, think about Donald Trump. We could decide that we would reelect him for a third term if we could constitutionally, which we can't. If he has violated his oath of office, if he has betrayed the public trust, even if we thought he would be the best president, we would be obligated to impeach him, that the Constitution would obligate us and would obligate everyone in the United States House and Senate who takes an oath to uphold the Constitution to do it, even if they suffer political fallout, even if they like Donald Trump, even if they thought Donald Trump was doing a bang-up job, because the whole purpose of a written Constitution is to take certain things out of the political process. So therefore, even if we all thought it was a good idea to have a common prayer in school and we could get 100% of the people in this room to vote on it, we still wouldn't be allowed to do it, because the purpose of having a constitutional written text is to say there are some things that are taken off the table. There are some things that you must do, some things you must not do, even if they are incredibly popular, even in some cases, if they may have some positive social good that will flow from them. So I won't tell you what I think about Donald Trump or what I think about the coming impeachment or what the politics of that will hold, because as we say in the history, that's out of my period. So I will now turn it over to someone who does know something about that, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions.
Thanks. Well, as you heard, the founders had a very high-minded idea about how impeachment should play out. But it is ultimately not just a constitutional process, but a political process. And when it comes to the politics of impeachment, it gets pretty low-minded pretty quickly, because that partisanship and that polarization come into play pretty quickly. And so what I want to talk about today is that political side to impeachment and why impeachment is going forward at this moment, what we can expect from the process, and how it's different from the two examples that we have in modern U.S. history, the case of the impeachment of Richard Nixon and the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And the first kind of puzzle we have to grapple with when it comes to the impeachment inquiry around Donald Trump is that pretty much everyone agrees that now that the Democrats have started an impeachment inquiry in the House, it seems very likely that they'll go forward with a public hearing, that they will hold a vote on articles of impeachment. That seems likely to be voted through the House, but then it goes to the Senate. And in the Senate, you have to have 2/3 of senators vote to convict and remove the president. And the Senate is controlled not by the Democrats, but by the Republicans. And so people also agree that it seems very, very unlikely that should Donald Trump be impeached, that he would then be convicted and removed from office. So why go through the trouble of impeaching him in the first place? And I think this is where history is really helpful for understanding the difference between this potential impeachment and the one between the ones faced by Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. Those two impeachments were in many ways punitive. They were punishment for things that the presidents had done while in office that violated their oath of office. Many Democrats see the impeachment of Donald Trump as preventative, as a way of exposing bad acts that are ongoing and to prevent interference with the 2020 election. And that makes it very different, because then the goal isn't necessarily to have Donald Trump removed from office prior to the 2020 election, but to thwart efforts to invite outside foreign interference in the 2020 election. So when it came to Richard Nixon was impeached for acts that had to do with interference in actually both the 1968 and the 1972 election. So that Watergate break-in was very much about, getting dirt on the Democrats for the 1972 election, and then afterwards breaking the law to cover up those bad acts. When it came to Bill Clinton, it was less about interference in an election and more about an affair that he had had. But again, that affair was by and large over by the time that Bill Clinton lied under oath about that affair. And it wasn't like Congress was trying to stop him from having future affairs or trying to stop him from lying under oath in the future about his affairs. It was a punishment for having, according to the Republicans at the time and some Democrats, violated his oath of office. This is a very different case. It is about exposing and exploring what are seen as bad acts and really being able to use the subpoena power of the Congress, the investigative powers of the Congress, to learn more about the things that are happening behind closed doors. Another major difference that really comes into play in that difference is that when it came to both Nixon and Clinton, they were in their second and final term in office. They were going to be out of office one way or another in a year or two, and they weren't going to be running for election again. It's a very different case with Donald Trump, who's still within his first term. That different rationale between punishment and prevention, I think, is in part responsible for why we're seeing a very different public response to this impeachment inquiry and possible impeachment vote than what we saw with Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. And that has to do with whether the public agrees that the president should be impeached and convicted and removed from office. When it came to Richard Nixon, it was over a year into the impeachment inquiry, once there was a smoking gun tape that showed that he had been responsible for the cover-up, that you finally had the public opinion moving in favor of impeachment. It was only in those final weeks before he resigned from office that the public said, yeah, this guy's got to go. With Bill Clinton, that never happened. There was never public support for impeachment. And in fact, by the time the House was getting ready to move from the impeachment inquiry to the impeachment vote, public approval for the impeachment inquiry itself was continuing to slide. The public was against the process from the very beginning. That's not the case when it comes to Donald Trump. Right now, there is either a plurality or a majority of Americans who support the impeachment inquiry, support impeachment, and actually support conviction and removal from office. Those numbers should be pretty troubling for the administration, and they really are unprecedented. We have not seen numbers like that in the modern era in support of the impeachment and removal of a president. Now, one of the reasons why the Trump administration is not as nervous about those numbers as you might expect them to be is who it is who supports impeachment and removal. I'm going to have the numbers written down here because I think that they're really, really important. Most of the support for impeachment is coming from Democrats and independents, not from Republicans. So since the Ukraine news broke about a month, 6 weeks ago now, 72% of Democrats had been supporting impeachment. Now 83% do. Very importantly, 34% of independents have supported impeachment. Now almost 48% do. But when it comes to Republicans, 9.5% had supported impeachment. Now only 11.5% do. So there's been very little movement among Republicans in support of impeachment and conviction. And even more troubling for people who support the impeachment inquiry is that up to 15% of Republicans had supported it, but now they've come back down to about 11%. So there is no real support among Republicans for this process. And so as a result, what you have is something that looks incredibly partisan. And that's actually why those independent numbers are also worth paying attention to. When he was elected in 2016, Donald Trump won independents by 1 point. So 43% of independents voted for Donald Trump, 42% voted for Hillary Clinton. Right now, independents have turned pretty strongly in favor of impeachment over the past month or so. But still, those Republican numbers are going to continue to shape the process because we don't anticipate that Republicans in Congress are going to be responsive to sort of the general public will, but rather to the will of the Republican base. And so far, their base doesn't support the impeachment process. Well, so what can we expect going forward? There are actually a couple of different hearings going on right now that could intersect with impeachment. The main focus of the impeachment inquiry in the House right now is focused on Ukraine, the withholding of aid in order to get dirt on a potential 2020 political rival in Joe Biden. But there are also House committees investigating taxes, There's recently a whistleblower who came forward about irregularities in Donald Trump's tax returns. So there are subpoenas going out about that. There's an effort to try to find out what's going on with his taxes. The Southern District of New York has an ongoing case that has implicated presidential lawyer Rudy Giuliani. And then there are a number of New York State prosecutions that are going on as well. And those sort of varied investigations, that itself is not unusual. When Richard Nixon was facing impeachment hearings, there was actually a whole other House committee that was looking into his taxes. If you know that famous line from Richard Nixon that I am not a crook, that wasn't about Watergate. That was about the investigation into his taxes. The House puts aside the investigation into his taxes to focus on Watergate, but there were many ongoing investigations at the same time, and that's true of Clinton as well. The Monica Lewinsky affair, that is ultimately the origin for lying under oath that Bill Clinton gets impeached for, that wasn't why there was a special prosecutor. The special prosecutor was there to look into all kinds of scandals that had been going on during the Clinton administration, unable to find anything indictable or impeachable in those investigations. Then attention turned to the affair with Monica Lewinsky. That does mean that it is possible that even though right now the impeachment inquiry is really focused on Ukraine, it could go in a number of different directions. So it wouldn't be unusual to see the subject of impeachment widen out. The inquiry that's going on now, largely behind closed doors, will almost certainly be followed by a public hearing. That will be followed by a vote in the House. And then things are going to move over to the Senate if the House votes to impeach President Trump. And now you have another unprecedented situation, because in the 1970s, when Richard Nixon was being investigated, going up for impeachment, when impeachment hearings were being held, Democrats held both houses of Congress. They had a majority in the House, they had a majority in the Senate. When Bill Clinton was facing impeachment, Republicans had a majority in the House and in the Senate. So the opposition party controlled the entire process. This is the first time that that's not the case, that you have the Republican Party, the party that's the same as the president, being in charge of impeachment. And that means we don't actually know what's going to happen if there's a trial in the Senate, because it will be run by Republicans who are the same party as the president. One of the big open questions, and I think that the thing everybody is looking at when it comes to impeachment, is whether or not Republican support for impeachment is going to change. So one of the reasons people are looking at this is because it's kind of built into the process that impeachment isn't going to necessarily be a partisan process. You need 2/3 of the vote in the Senate. That means that you need people from big states and from small states. Once there's a party system that comes into effect, it means that you need people from different parties to vote in favor of removing a president. It's not supposed to be a partisan thing. It's supposed to be something that has some sort of national consensus behind it. That means people really are looking to see if you can get even a handful of Republicans on board for impeachment and ultimately for conviction of Donald Trump. In fact, you absolutely need some 20 Republicans in the Senate to go along with this. When people look back at Richard Nixon's impeachment, initially it looked very partisan as well. Democrats were moving forward on impeachment, but Republicans did not support it. And then near the very end, there's a crumbling in Republican support. There was this sense that that's what's required. It's required for both parties to come to the same page. When you get to the Clinton impeachment, actually he gets the Republicans in Congress get Democrats to vote in favor of both impeachment and conviction, which is pretty impressive that the president's own party is moving forward on impeachment. And so there's this expectation that you need to have that in order to have a legitimate impeachment. But we live in a very, very different political time than even the 1970s or the 1990s. Polarization and partisanship in American politics has really scrambled what we can expect. This idea that there are going to be high-minded statesmen deciding the future of the president suggests that there are higher goals than just retaining political power. And it is not clear that that's actually what's at play here. We've seen a lot of irregularities in the way, in particular, the Senate has been run over the past 5 to 10 years. And so people suspect that, there might not even be a real trial in the Senate if President Trump is impeached, because Mitch McConnell will sort of say, here's kind of a pro forma trial. We opened a trial, we gavelled it out, and now we're done. We're putting this behind us. And there really is no backup, right? If the Senate doesn't move forward with an impeachment trial of any real sort, that's it. There's nothing else that you can do about it other than go to the polls in 2020, or if it ends up bleeding over into the president's second term, then you can try impeaching again. You can wait until the composition of the Congress changes. But other than that, there are no real remedies when it comes to impeachment and removal. And so in many ways, one of the things that we are seeing is that just as rising polarization and partisanship has warped many other things in the political process. So think about the Supreme Court and the blocking of Merrick Garland's nomination at the end of Obama's term, right? That idea that the Senate just isn't going to move on a Supreme Court nomination, that was something that was pretty unprecedented in the modern era. But once it started to happen, there was nothing you could do to stop it, right? That was the Senate's power. And so this is another process that we may see just doesn't really hold up in an era of extreme polarization and partisanship. So it's nearly impossible to know what is going to happen next. It is important to know that as people talk about previous impeachments, when it comes to Nixon, when it comes to Clinton, that there might be parallels and there might be echoes and there might be analogies, but things aren't going to unfold in the same way. We're in a very different media environment. We're in a very different political environment. And so anybody who tells you they know what's going to happen next, don't listen. They probably don't know. And with that, we should open it up for Q&A.
Yeah. So instead of passing the microphone around to students who have questions, I think it might be easier for you guys just to repeat some version of the question. That way,
Fair enough.
Run back and forth. And if I could ask both of you to move more towards the center so we get you into the live stream, that would be great as well. Yes.
If there is a trial in the Senate, how much of the control of that process would fall on Mitch McConnell, and how, would Chief Justice Roberts have any say in that? I know there isn't really precedent for it, but what do you guys think?
So the question is, if there is a trial, how much control over that trial process does Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate, have, and how much does Chief Justice Roberts, who presides over the trial, how much control does he have? I think that it's, there are certain things that they have to do according to the Constitution, and maybe you can speak to those. And so there are things that Mitch McConnell has to, he has to have some sort of trial. But I think beyond that, there's not a lot that's written down. And because of that, it really is more of a norms process than a rules process.
I think that's accurate, that the Constitution is very, very vague on particulars. It's very clear there'll have to be a trial. What that means is pretty wide open. Once rules are set, I think Chief Justice Roberts will have a certain amount of room once he's in the position of presiding over it. But in terms of setting the ground rules, Mitch McConnell pretty much has, it's all in his court, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
In regards to this entire impeachment process, what will the timeline look like? Or how could the timeline affect what might happen?
That's a very good question. Of course, in terms of law and constitutional requirements, there are no clear timelines laid out. I think probably what's going to happen is politics will drive the timeline. It seems clear that Democrats have considerable incentive to stretch out the process, to expose as much corruption as they can. And then once a vote is taken, it goes over to the Senate. Mitch McConnell will have the same kind of incentive to shut it down as quickly as he can, as long as he provides something that is recognizable as a trial in some very, very attenuated sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, politics is going to be a major driver. And one of the things you should be taking away from this is, even though we're using legal terms to talk about, trials and conviction, that again, this is a very political process. And so I think that's right. I mean, the big stopper here is the election, right? So in some sense, Democrats in the House are going to want to spend a lot of time on this, first because it's a very complex issue, but also they're going to want to clear the field at a certain point in time so that there can be a debate for the 2020 election, so that there is some oxygen for the candidates who are out there either in the primaries or in the general election. And so one of the things that House leadership has said is that they want to have everything wrapped up by the end of 2019. That seems unlikely because there's a lot that has to happen and there are a lot of holidays at the end of the year. But there is a real political consideration that's going to be governing most, if not all, of the timeline.
And one other thing to keep in mind is the people who are in sort of safe Republican Senate seats, it's pretty clear what their incentives are. People in purple states, people whose seats are far less secure, like Susan Collins or people in Ohio or Lisa Murkowski, they have a very, very interesting calculus because they have a potential to be primaried from either side, either from someone who's a very strong Trump supporter or for someone who wants to align themselves with, let's say, the Mitt Romney wing of the Republican Party. So the dynamics, I think the chances of getting enough votes to remove would take something really quite remarkable, almost Hollywood-like in its scripting. For a simple majority for the Democrats, totally within the range of possibility, but will depend on the political dynamics at home for those candidates who really find themselves in very, very purple political states.
What do you guys, I just wanted to hear you, I guess, both speak to like the politics and I guess sort of precedents of the like Republican barging in on this secured committee, I think just last week. And so I guess my main question about that is like, and this build it into your larger point, which was like, right now, the Republican talking point is that this is a Democratic thing. They're not letting us in, blah, 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 blah. Doesn't it just flip that back? Like once they have it in the Senate, and then like, how do we go from here? And is that something that we should be concerned about, the fact that like this code and regulation was violated?
Right, so the question is about something that happened last week when a couple of dozen Republican congressmen stormed into this secure facility where some of the private impeachment inquiries were being held. And what does that mean for what's going on with that? But what does it mean for like the process as a whole? What does it tell us about what's going on right now? There's this very famous political saying that when the facts are on your side, argue the facts, and the facts aren't on your side, argue the law, and when the law is not on your side, then just pound on the table. And this is very much like a pound on the table moment where it was, I think, largely about changing the storyline, right? Getting people to talk about something other than the specifics of the Ukraine inquiry, because the past like month or so of revelations about what happened with Ukraine have not been good as a storyline for the president or for Republicans. Like the public has moved pretty significantly, especially Democrats and independents, based on the things that they have learned about what happened with Ukraine. So one of the things that Republicans have to do is they have to get people to stop learning things about what happened with Ukraine. And so like having these big dramatic moments, now that's not unprecedented. I mean, storming a skiff is pretty unusual. It's not unprecedented for members of Congress to indulge in drama. It's not unprecedented for them to argue about process. But I'm not sure that it was that effective in moving the conversation onto process. But you would anticipate that process line of argument, that this isn't fair, that it's being conducted in secret once it moves to an open hearing, that this is a media circus once it moves to the Senate. All right, well, we're going to be the grown-ups and shut this down because it was an unfair process. That's kind of where you would anticipate, at least now, the line of argument going. And that's what that sort of moment was about changing what it was that people focused on and delegitimating the process that's happening.
So a couple things to keep in mind. So first of all, the people who were storming the room, several of them were on the committee and had access to the room. So that raises some questions about whether we're dealing with substance or theater. The second point is, if you think about the proper analogy that the House is engaged in a process very similar to a grand jury, and the Senate will be engaged in something very similar to a process of a trial, you don't get to bring your lawyer to a grand jury, and grand juries are secret. In fact, one of the issues now is, can they get access to the Mueller grand jury? Because it's so secret that even people in Congress who find that there might be useful pieces of information relevant to the impeachment haven't yet seen that. They likely will get access to it because impeachment does open up a whole series of investigative possibilities that you couldn't actually access unless you were involved in an act of impeachment. So I think there's a certain amount of disingenuous politicking going on, because the rules that we're operating under were rules that were created by Republicans under John Boehner when they wrote the rules. So if you were looking at this in a kind of serious intellectual and legal way, you really couldn't make a serious argument that there are procedural problems now. They're doing it exactly the way they were supposed to do it, and they're doing it in secret, which is what they're supposed to do. And the next phase will be public. And now, if they tried to keep the next phase from being public, then they'd have a very serious procedural concern on their hands. And one of the problems in our sort of media climate is we've sort of reached this crazy point in America where you have to present two sides of everything. Even if someone is saying 2 + 2 is 5, you have to have someone from the anti-math league up there saying, well, we find that math is just oppressive, and, saying 2 + 2 is 4 is just not fair. You have to give equal time to people who say 2 + 2 is 5. There are some things in this impeachment debate that are just not arguable. And it would be much better for everyone if people were arguing, seriously and in an intellectually rigorous fashion. And that's never happened in American politics. So I don't expect it to happen anytime soon. Other questions?
A lot of what's been talked about today has been that a lot of the process was kind of set up by the founders, and that they didn't have this partisan frame in mind. Like, they were very much anti-factionalism. But as politics in the United States has progressed, it's become increasingly factionalized and increasingly partisan. And I don't think it's, in my opinion, I don't think it's likely to change. So is there a feasible remedy to that, to make something like impeachment, which is an important process of, getting rid of someone who's not doing their job or has betrayed the trust of the American people, into something that's nonpartisan?
Wow.
So the question is, maybe impeachment was dreamed up in this fever dream of a nonpartisan politics where government is full of people who will put their own personal interests aside in order to protect the public interest. That's not the case. So is there a better way to do this? Is there a way to take politics out of it? No, I don't think that there's a way to really take politics out of it. But I also don't think that the solution is solely procedural, which is to say, this is a political problem, but it's also a social problem. I mean, there are so many people who are totally in favor of the process as it's playing out now. And a lot of that has to do with a broader fracturing in society. I mean, something that we've seen in the past 10 to 20 years, but let's not pretend the past was this great place where everybody kumbaya'd and got along. But particularly in the past, 10 to 20 years, there's been such a fracturing of common facts. So everybody, people might disagree on what a good policy is, but at least they could agree on the climate is changing or something like that, right? Maybe we fix it in different ways, but we can at least agree on the problem. That's not the case anymore. And so part of what we're seeing in particular is that with different media environments and different sets of facts, there's no argument that's even happening on the same page. And so that becomes the problem that you have to fix more than the process of impeachment. And I wish I had great answers for how we can do that. I think it's an incredibly complex problem, but maybe you have some ideas on how to fix everything.
Well, one of the interesting things is that with the possible exception of the abolitionists in the 19th century, hardly anyone in American history, once the Constitution is ratified, says the Constitution just has got to go. It's just a terrible mistake. We need to move on to something else. Americans are pretty broadly united. Like, even if you go back to the time when Eugene Debs, the only socialist candidate who ever really polled over 1 million voters, he always claimed that he was a Jeffersonian and he was working to, he would argue, that socialism is Americanism, that he's true to the Constitution. So one of the interesting things that's been happening in the last couple of years, there are actually people seriously saying, we need to revise the Constitution. Now, whether we need to scrap the Constitution, that's a pretty extreme view. But there are definitely people saying things like, we need to get rid of the Electoral College, or we need to change the rules in the Senate so that you can't filibuster things the way they've done. We need to take some of the principles and practices that were embedded in our norms, which are not legally binding, and maybe elevate them to the level of legal principle so that we can restore some kind of functionality to the political process. So there is no magic bullet to clear away all the chaos and problems we have. But I think it's fair to say there are at least a few things one might imagine. We could have less money in politics. We could change the Electoral College. We don't even need to actually get rid of it. We could use proportional representation in the Electoral College instead of winner take all. There are some things that are plausible. Doing any amendment to the Constitution is hard, deliberately so. But there are a few things that would make our political system less dysfunctional. I don't know whether they would deal with the current situation. We're in really kind of a remarkable time. I'm really not since Andrew Johnson and the great impeachment of the 19th century, and that came within one vote of Andrew Johnson being removed from office, have we seen a figure quite as polarizing as Donald Trump. And in fact, I was talking to friends of mine. I said, there's really been no one like Donald Trump, certainly no one who's abused the English language like Donald Trump. My own personal favorite amendment is, whoever to be president of the United States, you have to speak English at least as well as the president of France. That would be like my one, amendment that I would sort of set as the floor. But they said, well, Andrew Johnson was probably less educated than Donald Trump, coarser than Donald Trump, and arguably less, functional than Donald Trump. So we haven't hit bottom yet. That's the one optimistic thing I can tell you today. We actually haven't hit bottom. Andrew Johnson may still be the worst president in American history. But,
There's still time.
There's still time.
I would just add to that one other functional thing, though I'm not sure how you would do it without a constitutional amendment, is to find a way to protect voting rights so that everyone who wanted to come out to vote could come out to vote. And that's something that is a genuine problem that needs fixing. The other thing that I would say is that, if you look back over the course of American history, this sacrosanct Constitution gets amended in these times of real social upheaval. So you have several amendments that are passed after the Civil War. You have several more that are added in the early 20th century after we've gone through the dislocation of industrialization and urbanization. As the country changed, the Constitution changed. We haven't had a constitutional amendment in 50 years. And there have definitely been major social changes that have cried out for some sort of a constitutional amendment, some sort of constitutional adaptation, and in particular, because there has been, I think, a pretty significant shift in how people believe democracy should function. This idea of one person, one vote was extremely unfashionable back at the time of the writing of the Constitution, but so many Americans today take it as a given. Like, isn't that the way that democracy works? Well, not according to the Constitution. And so the idea that that sort of shared notion is not reflected in the structure of our government is a real problem. But of course, the ability to pass a constitutional amendment requires that kind of across-the-board consensus that has been almost impossible to generate for half a century.
My question is that since Donald Trump's election, his presidency has been overall pretty controversial. And I guess my question is, in your professional opinion, do you believe that the people have a case in bringing Donald Trump to trial for impeachment?
So just to clarify the question, so do we believe in our professional opinion that there's a case to be made for impeachment?
Like everything, what's in the media and news channels, everything people's evidence, do you believe that they have a believable or
Credible?
credible
Right.
case?
Great. So the question is there a credible case for impeachment? Just looking over what it is that we know. And this is actually a harder question than it might sound like, because then the question becomes, well, what makes a credible case for impeachment? Because the underlying ideas, high crimes and misdemeanor, they don't appear in a glossary at the back of the Constitution. Like, there's nothing that really defines them, except for, like, has there been a violation of this oath of office? From what we have heard so far in the press, and have seen documents of, the documents that the administration itself has released, the witness testimony that we've heard so far, it seems pretty clear that the president invited foreign interference in the 2016 and the 2020 election in order to swing the vote in his favor. So you putting his personal political advancement over the national interest. That seems to me to be an impeachable offense. The case can certainly be made. And if you add on to that things like obstruction of justice, which I think we have ample evidence of as well, a credible case could be made. And in fact, one way we know that a credible case has been made is that the American people on the whole find it credible. And that their support for impeachment has changed significantly as those facts have come out, which I also think is important because of the point that you made at the beginning of your question, which is, well, he's been this controversial, polarizing president from the moment he entered office. And that has stayed true throughout his campaign, it stayed true throughout his presidency, but something is moving the numbers in favor of impeachment. And that seems to be people are getting new information and they're responding to it.
So one of the interesting things, if you narrow the focus just to the Ukraine, and of course there are arguments to be made that there's stuff in the Mueller report that eminently qualifies for an impeachable offense, is what I find most interesting is Donald Trump, having released not a verbatim transcript, but a transcript of his phone call, doesn't, I'm sure, believe that he did anything wrong when he said, you know, I want to ask you a favor, though. I think, from my point of view, holding up that aid, particularly since he wanted something that would help him and not the American nation and would not further our foreign policy goals, that clearly is an impeachable offense. And what I find so amazing about it all is it used to be a fixture in American politics that the one thing you would count on the conservative wing of American politics is an almost militant, sometimes irrational, but oftentimes prudent concern about the power of the Soviet Union and of Russia. And what is so remarkable and has kind of fallen out of public debate, except for very few commentators, is the reason we were funding the Ukraine is because Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia took part of Ukraine, and a strong Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, is absolutely essential to American foreign policy interests, unless you think that Vladimir Putin and Russia is really our friend and we should do everything to embolden and empower Putin because his aims are what's best for America's interests and what's best for freedom and democracy in the world. And I have to say this, I have to put my cards on the table. A lot of my family came from that part of the world and don't have fond memories of it. So I find that very strange because it used to be kind of the lodestar of Republicans, from Barry Goldwater to William Buckley, that American foreign policy had to meet aggression from Russia with equal force. That was the essence of sort of Kennan's containment doctrine, which was sometimes perhaps misinterpreted. But the fact that that's not central to the Republican Party today, to me, is kind of astonishing. Because I would have never predicted that if you had told me the Russians would somehow become the good guys to Republicans. That is really kind of, I still can't get my head around it.
The one thing, though, that I would add to that is impeachment isn't necessarily a solution for policy differences. You could have a politician who says, we should support Ukraine. You could have another who says, no, you know what, we should support Russia. And that's a policy difference that you settle through elections and through public debate. This is something different. This isn't about the president's policy toward Ukraine. It's not about the president's policy toward Russia so much as it is that larger global question wasn't what was driving any of the actions. What was driving the actions was, is this going to help me as a politician who is running for office in 2020? And not because the American people will side with me because they agree with my policy toward Ukraine, but rather because they're going to, from everything that we've heard, fabricate dirt against my most likely 2020 opponent. And that's something that's very different than a foreign policy debate over what side the US should be on.
Yeah, and the one other point is Congress, on a bipartisan basis, allocated those funds. So unless there was a legal and constitutional reason to impound them, his obligation to fulfill the oath of office is to do what Congress said, which is to make these funds available for the Ukrainians to buy missiles or whatever else they need. So that in of itself, doing something not because you have a constitutional scruple about, and you take an appropriate constitutional response to stop it from happening, but trying to do something through a sort of backdoor foreign policy, that also sort of speaks to kind of an impeachable offense. If he thought, there's too much corruption in the Ukraine, we can't let this money go forward. We have a State Department, we have a Department of Defense, we have all kinds of people on the ground who could monitor or could adjudicate whether or not Ukraine was in fact mired in corruption or whether the money would be spent for the purpose Congress allocated. But that's not what happened. And that would have been the legitimate exercise of executive authority. But again, that's not what happened.
So if partisanship is one of the major problems here in proceeding with the process and making things more difficult, what do you guys see as the major moments where that partisanship got jacked up over the last, say, 20 or 40 years, if you want to go back to the 70s?
So the question is, okay, so partisanship seems to be the real problem with making impeachment move forward the way that it was laid out in the Constitution. So what caused this sort of warping partisanship that we've seen? Well, the first thing is that it has been an uneven polarization. That the kind of partisan polarization that we're talking about was primarily driven by Republicans, and it has been taken to a further extreme by Republicans. And that's actually really important because words like partisanship and polarization make it just seem like a process that just happens, right? So the Democrats go this way, the Republicans go that way, and all of a sudden we're polarized. That hasn't been the case in recent American history. And there are a lot of different factors for it. First, the most important is that we used to have two parties that disagreed on a lot, but that weren't necessarily ideologically sorted. Which is to say, like in the 1950s and 60s, you had conservative Democrats and you had liberal Republicans. Over the course of the 70s and 80s, that changed, and it changed much more within the Republican Party than the Democratic. There were many more conservative Democrats than there were liberal Republicans by, say, the 1990s. Another major driver of it, a really important driver of it, has been a shifting media landscape. And I should say my first book was on the origins of conservative media in the United States and the role of conservative media in Republican politics. And that has had a real effect on partisanship and polarization in the US, because by having an explicitly partisan news source that becomes the main framework for understanding politics, you do begin to have a different set of facts that don't necessarily move in the direction of compromise or understanding the other side, right? They're much more focused on reaffirming your identity as a conservative Republican, and that being the thing that drives all of your political actions. That's a real change. And we've seen some of the consequences of that over the past 10 or 15 years or so, as that media environment has gotten even bigger and more closed off in a lot of ways. So those are two that I'll throw out, and then I'll let you pick up some.
No, I think those are probably two of the most important ones. The only one I would add is that the structure of the way parties work has changed. It used to be in the day, once upon a time, Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson could sort of get together and decide what's going to happen. And they could whip their their parties into line. They could withhold chairmanships. They could use old-fashioned pork barrel politics, but they were able to exert a tremendous amount of party discipline. One of the interesting things about the way the mass media and new media has changed things is you can sort of tweet yourself around the political bosses. And that's in some ways a democratization of politics, and that may be good, but it also means there are people who used to be able to act as brakes and strike deals who no longer have that power. You hardly ever hear about the majority whip or the minority whip. All the power seems to have devolved to the majority leader and the minority leader, and I don't know that that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important, that we used to have, as much as the founders derided political parties become kind of an organizing apparatus of American political life. And these are organizations that have really in the past 30 or 40 years almost completely ceased to function except as labels. So there used to be sort of media and money and messaging were all coming from the party. Now they've been outsourced. So because the Republican Party is what I study, like for the Republican Party, messaging is not coming from the party, it's coming from conservative media. Money is not coming from the party, it's coming from super PACs and outside donors, and now being able to give a limited amount of money to whoever they want. And the movement is being organized quite often in separate organizations that are not the Republican Party, but are conservative organizing groups. And so that kind of lack of party power, the collapse really of American parties as organizations, have also helped to feed that kind of polarization because it's driven much more by these outside organizations. And so in order to attract the money of a conservative super PAC, it's not about being able necessarily to pass laws, it's about being able to appeal to the maximal conservative position. That changes what primaries look like, changes who wins primaries, and that fundamentally changes who's going to be in office and what that person is willing to compromise on while in office. And so while you do have right now, I mean, pretty impressive party loyalty in a sense, right? The Republicans aren't moving at all when it comes to impeachment. That isn't necessarily being driven by the Republican leadership so much as it's being driven by a fear of the Republican base.
Yeah, we really have created, in a way, the worst of all possible worlds. Way to go. Good job. We now have ideological and rabid partisanship without any of the benefits of party. I mean, it's sort of like, I remember when I was in graduate school, I saw someone putting up posters for a Republican candidate in Philadelphia, which of course was a labor of love because Philadelphia is like New York. It's not a great city for Republicans by and large. And I said something, and because I'm sure this will you find this shocking that I was a Democrat when I was in college. Now I'm a monarchist, in case any of you are wondering what my politics are. I think the American Revolution was a mistake. You should always have a tea at 4:00, be much more civil. And I said something to him, being the angry young man that I was, of course. Now you see before you a very satisfied old man. And he said, come on, I'm best friends with the guy who's head of the Democratic Party. We go out for beers all the time. Give me a break. And in retrospect, that was a great and glorious thing that I did not appreciate. That wouldn't happen now. That whole party, structure is pretty much gone. And, the way I can best think about it is now all we have is like, political Tinder where nobody's going to swipe if you're the wrong party, and there's no local party to go to. So it's all mediated by this kind of ideological cyber world, and there's no human structure and political structure to mediate it. And that is a great loss because a lot got worked out through those political structures that the internet is not very good at working out.
That political Tinder comment actually also makes the point that this isn't just happening in Washington, D.C. This isn't just happening for people who are running for office. This is happening in people's daily lives. That you are much less likely to have a mixed marriage of a Republican and a Democrat than you were even 20 years ago. You're much less likely to live next to somebody whose political beliefs are different from yours than you were 40 or 50 years ago. And so that kind of political sorting has also played a role in this kind of polarization?
The founders all lived through the revolution. They all lived through this moment of a relatively large-scale political violence. You invoked the classical examples of Publius, etc., and certainly they must have been familiar with the extraordinary ways that the Roman Republic disintegrated in political violence. When we talk about the Articles of Confederation, and when we talk about the origins of the Constitution, we tend to reference the Articles of Confederation. I'm just curious to what extent the Constitution generally, but more particularly the impeachment component, is seen as a way of dealing with or forestalling specifically political violence.
That's a great question. Benjamin Franklin, of all people, in the Constitutional Convention, argues that impeachment is absolutely necessary so that we don't have assassination. So I think your point about, the fault is in ourselves, not our stars, is a reference to Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Franklin clearly is thinking in precisely those terms, that without a constitutional mechanism to check a potentially tyrannical ruler and remove them, we will go back to a Roman-style coup d'etat as the only way to do that. And that's not good for anyone. So I think you're quite right. I think impeachment is seen as a safety valve among many other things.
I think that idea of safety valves, right, runs throughout the Constitution, and that's I think that's the best way that I've heard it put, that it's a forestalling.
To sort of piggyback off that question, although it might be a safety valve in that one sense, do you fear that as impeachment goes on, things will be more and more polarized? Or do you think it'll sort of remain where it is? And then this also gets to my larger question, which I don't know if you'll be able to answer or not, that what happens if Donald Trump gets impeached, and who enforces that? What if he doesn't get impeached and it's the 2020 election and he loses? What happens then? I think to the question of political violence, I don't know that we're just all assuming that Donald Trump's going to do whatever the people say that he's going to do,
So the question is, kind of piggybacking off the last one, so impeachment could be a safety valve, but aren't things going to get a lot worse in the process? And then what happens if Donald Trump is convicted? How does he get removed from office? Or if he loses the 2020 election, who removes him from office? So on the first question, I do think that particularly in this administration, that the more threat that the president is under, the more dialed up his rhetoric gets, and the more dangerous of a political situation that people are in, or more dangerous a situation people are in general. There has been a lot of talk about, what happened, if Donald Trump doesn't leave office after he is removed. Thinking about leaving office as a process of not holding space, right? Because he's going to get kicked out of the Oval Office. That's going to be easy enough. But it's more of a question of the legitimacy of the next president. Will that person be considered legitimate by Trump's continued supporters if he is convicted or loses office? And how might they act if they don't see the next president as legitimate, or they see their power as being removed? And this goes back to the language of coup and civil war that have become more common coming from the White House in the last month or so, right? That's dangerous language. And I think that to a certain extent, people don't always take it seriously. So you might have, if any of you were on Twitter when the president said that there might be a civil war if he is impeached, people are making fun of that because they're like, what, are people gonna break out their muskets and go to war? No, they're not likely to do that. What we're likely to see is something that's much more akin to the kinds of political violence that we saw in the 1990s in the US, which is more terroristic violence. And there is every reason to believe that that is a force that can be unleashed. There's every reason to believe that that is a force that is already unleashed in our society. And for people who support impeachment and conviction, that's even more of a reason to support impeachment and conviction, because there's not, I don't know that there is a way to forestall that or to stop that from happening.
I think that's a point that's important to stress, is that one of the many regrettable things about the way President Trump's rhetoric has heated up our political debate and our sort of public debate is it has given comfort to some very, very potentially dangerous, lawless strains in American culture. The other problem is the devaluing of career civil servants in the State Department and in other parts of our government, because it seems to me that you can't really have an effective foreign policy. You can't really protect American defense without a very strong foreign service, State Department, without assets, and without honoring treaty obligations and honoring commitments. And so one of the real problems by this sort of deep state rhetoric, and going back to Dwight David Eisenhower, we have the military-industrial complex, and there's no question there are aspects of our economy and of think tanks and other things that have an ideology that supports a kind of internationalist foreign policy and economic policy, and you can agree with that or disagree with that. But there are also people like Bill Taylor who testified, and you look at the guy's history, and it's just remarkable that anyone could say anything negative about him. West Point graduate, paratrooper in Vietnam, and a career civil servant. And again, you may disagree with him, although again, the one thing I wouldn't call him is kind of flaming left-wing radical. He really is a kind of real politique, old-fashioned Republican conservative who really is quite fearful of Russian power. The way that people like that have been tossed under the bus is just not good, because we need that expertise to keep us safe, and it's going to make it very difficult for us to move forward. And that also troubles me, the kind of long-term damage that we've done to those parts of our government that are essential for our national security. Other questions? We've worn you down. Yep, one more.
This is going back to a topic that you covered a little bit earlier, but I'm curious. Obviously, I understand that neither of you are Nancy Pelosi, but a lot of a common sort of thread of liberal and left-leaning commentary after the release of the Mueller report was that the Mueller report offered a prescription for impeachment. That the sort of the content that was given there should have been enough, going back to your earlier remarks, Dr. Cornell, about the idea that high crimes and misdemeanors sort of refer to crimes against like the American polity, not necessarily criminal charges. So my question for you is, why impeachment now and not then? Like what has shifted in American political life to make impeachment now seem like a viable option for congressional Democrats, where presumably it wasn't at the release of the Mueller?
So the question is, Robert Mueller seemed to have written an outline for impeachment for Democrats, and yet they didn't do anything with it. Why are they now moving forward with impeachment when they didn't then? What changed? So I think a couple of things changed. First of all, I do think that is what Robert Mueller did. Robert Mueller was like, here, investigate this. It's your job, Congress. And Congress said, no thanks. Why? So that's the first question. Why does Congress say no thanks? I think that Nancy Pelosi says no thanks because everything around the Mueller report had gotten so muddled that they didn't have a clear message coming out of it. And there was no sense that she was going to be able to bring her caucus around on it and support it. And in fact, I think that's kind of where she was on Ukraine until the moderate members of her caucus came out in the Washington Post and said, we might lose our seats over this, but this has gone too far. This is a national emergency and we need to act. And she was, in many ways, I wouldn't say pushed, because I think that Nancy Pelosi is a very savvy political leader, but definitely read that she was in a changed situation and that she now could act on impeachment. And possibly that there was a miscalculation in the sense that because the poll numbers were so bad on impeachment coming out of the Mueller report, that was kind of like, oh, well, I guess we can't do this. One of the things that we've seen in the last month or so is that actually when the Democrats said, okay, we're going to move forward with an impeachment inquiry, the poll numbers changed along with them. So by moving forward on an impeachment inquiry, they were actually able to begin to move public opinion. So I think that those are a couple of things that changed.
So another thing that changed is, first of all, the Mueller, I'm pretty sure that the only Democratic presidential candidate who's gotten through both volumes is Elizabeth Warren. That, 700 pages is just not a narrative that most people in Congress or most Americans can get their head around. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the equivalent to the smoking gun in Ukraine, which is the phone call. He says, I want a favor, though, is when he tells Don McGahn to go fire, and McGahn says, are you crazy, and won't do it. So in a way, McGahn puts his hand on the gun and prevents Trump from pulling the trigger that would have given us the comparable smoking gun. So there's those two things. And then the final difference is there was always a sense that what the Mueller report was doing was, looking backward, like, get over it. Donald Trump won. Why are you Democrats doing this? This is about trying to interfere with the next election, which makes it a very, very different. It's not subject to that same kind of dismissal. Oh, you guys just have sour grapes. It's, we need to protect our elections from future interference. So I think those three things account for, it's a simple narrative. Everyone, apparently, except some people on Fox News, were able to actually read the letter, the transcript. Sorry, President Trump said it's a letter. It was a transcript of a phone call. It's a short document, and it's pretty clear when he says, I want a favor, though. I mean, I think there's really no ambiguity there, whereas the Mueller report is just too filled with detail.
Yeah.
One more.
I just wanted to ask, was the video itself, do you feel that like the video where he suggests that Ukraine and China should look at Biden, is that onto itself enough, or no? Do you think the transcript, because he's just telling them to investigate and there's no quid pro quo in that scenario?
So the question is, there's a video of Donald Trump telling
Reporters on the South Lawn.
telling
going to a helicopter. And
where he's doing one of his press conferences and he says China should go investigate Biden, Ukraine should. Is that enough for an impeachable offense? I think that it could fit into the case. It's very much like the 2016 campaign when he's like, Russia, go find Hillary Clinton's emails, in which he is inviting foreign interference, but you lack kind of that larger mechanism of the abuse of power. You could say that rhetoric is an abuse of power, or that invitation is an abuse of power, but actually withholding congressional aid to Ukraine is actually doing something more.
Yeah, I think, again, the problem with that is Trump has so changed the bar by which we judge presidential behavior that, if Barack Obama had done that out of the gate, there would have been people screaming for impeachment right away. Problem is, Trump doing that after everything else he's done, a lot of people are saying, well, that's just Trump being Trump. And even if it is consistent with a pattern of abuse, and even if it is in some technical sense impeachable, you go from the sublime to the absurd. That's the problem with Trump is, people sort of describe this phenomenon where he does something so outrageous and shapes the news cycle so quickly, people can't act. He's like the ADD president. You can't really sort of focus on something before something new has happened. Even like this, the late night comedians say that like if they do a conference with their writers at the beginning of the week, they have to scrap it by Thursday because the news cycle has moved so fast with them.
I think we're gonna call it there. Thank you guys for
thanks
such
for great
wonderful
questions. Thanks for coming
Really
out.
appreciate it.
Yes, let's remember to turn it off.